Thank you very much for inviting me to chat to you again this morning about the Rare Plant Monitoring Scheme. This scheme was launched in 2017. So it's a citizen science scheme, but really it's skilled expert volunteers that take part. And it's a long-term scheme, so it'll take a while to get established. Just to start, I suppose, by saying a wee bit about why we decided to set it up in the first place. And the main reason really is that you need as much data as possible on rare species for effective conservation assessment. So when you're doing a red list, you need as much data as possible. You might know, within red lists, when you're doing the vascular plant red list or a bee red list or any other one, you're allocating all the species to one of these red list categories, whether it's least concern or whether it gets a threat like critically endangered or vulnerable. And it's actually really hard to allocate something a red list category. It's a very rigorous process. So when you're doing it, the IUCN have these 5 criteria, and to be allocated threatened, you have to meet the terms of those criteria and you have to be based on data. So for rare species which are more at risk, so I think it's really important that they are accurately, the conservation status of them is accurately assessed. And when you are assessing rare species, there's 2 of those criteria that are most important, and that's C and D. And for rare species, for example, if you wanted to say a rare species was endangered under criterion D there, you'd have to actually be able to say that there were only 50 to 249 remaining individuals. So if you want to accurately assess rare species in a red list, which I think is really important because it flags, things that are really in trouble, you need really good data on the number of individuals. It's as simple as that. So it's difficult to collect that at any scale. I think, we all understand that. If we look at the vascular plant red list from 2016, there's 106 threatened species, there's 98 near threatened, each of those occurring at various locations across the country, which adds up to an awful lot of rare plant populations. So I suppose the more data that we can be collecting on those from whatever streams possible, the better. And I suppose why we felt within the National Biodiversity Data Centre that we could play a role was that we receive lots of casual data on plants, and some of it's really high quality data and some of it's on rare species. So what we wanted to do was to maximise the value of that recorder effort. So within the centre, we're receiving increasing numbers of casual plant records. You can see this graph just shows the increase since 2016. So, last year, in 2019, there was over 30,000 validated casual plant records coming in. This year it's increased again. I think we're all seeing, this huge increase in interest in biodiversity, during lockdown, which is really fantastic to see. And actually just during lockdown, the 1st of April to the 30th of June, we got 23,700 odd records that have now gone for validation. And I suppose just to flag that this, to be honest, within the centre, this has increased so much that we've been struggling really to cope with it. And what we wanted to do was to be able to support those recorders a wee bit better, and also to create more of a link, to be honest, with the BSBI. So we're very grateful to the National Parks and Wildlife Service who provided with small bit extra funding to help us employ Paul Green, who has been helping with this vascular plant casual record validation since 2019. And I'm sure Paul was thrilled to get the 23,000 extra records to validate in the last batch. So those casual records come in either through our online recording form on the website or through the recording app that we have. They're then validated, and it's only the validated data that goes into our databases, which are available through biodiversity maps. And you can see, so all the casual records, plant records that come into us, they're stored in their own database. So obviously we collect plant records from various different sources, and we store them, within separate data sets, which then all come together to show the plant distribution data that we have. But all the casual data is stored in its own data set, this online atlas of vascular plants. And again, we set this up specifically at the time in the hope that it might be able to make some contribution towards the BSBI atlas. And this data available to freely download, and I think that you have done that, and put into the big database and use whichever components of it you wish. So all this data comes in, and what I've been doing is each year looking at what's coming in, and I have another file with all the threatened and near threatened vascular plant records, and I get a cross check against the two, and it flags up anything that is rare or interesting. And what I've then been doing is just getting in touch with that recorder and saying, would you be interested in the rare plant monitoring scheme? And what it means is just going out once a year, visiting your population again and counting how many individuals there are. So really that's all they're asked to do. They go back, count the number of individuals and submit very basic information about the plant population, and then each year they count. So it's very simple. We've kept it dead simple, to make it as, the burden, I suppose, on recorders as low as possible, while at the same time hopefully collecting useful data. So they fill in information about the site, a wee tiny bit about the rare plants, really just, it's relatively basic information, but hopefully the kind of stuff that you'd need. And then each year they're asked to go back, fill in the date they went, the number of individuals that they saw, and then any notes that they want to make. And really, it is as simple as that. Who takes part? Mostly, to be honest, it's experienced plant recorders, but that wouldn't really have any particular affiliation. And that's, I suppose, most people would fall into that bracket. Also, then we have BSBI members, and I know that many of you have been contributing to the scheme, and thank you for that, and we're really grateful for your contributions. There are also some MPWS field staff, and there are some consultants who've been taking part. So a real mix of people. Just to say, it's a citizen science scheme, and the way I set it up, there's no pressure to take part. So I want it to be something that people would enjoy doing. We try really hard to link people to a population that's close to where they live or visit, so that there's no burden in terms of having to go back to that population. And also, no one is ever asked to go out and search for a new rare plant or anything like that. They've already found it, they've correctly identified it, and they've come to us that way. So I suppose it's sort of self-selecting in that respect. So in 2017, that's when we set the scheme up, and I suppose there was a wee bit of testing the water, to be honest, to see if there was going to be any interest in this. And thankfully, there was a huge interest straight away. So in 2017, when we piloted with it, 37 populations were monitored, 22 different species, and 18 recorders took part. Since then, it's been growing. So in 2018, the number of populations increased from 37 to 103. 2019 again has gone up to 148, and 80 species recorded. So I suppose in my master data set at the minute, there are 173 different populations across 83 species. And I suppose that's just reflective of, some of the populations, for example, that would have been monitored in 2018 weren't necessarily monitored again in 2019. So at the minute, there's 173 populations that have been monitored at some point across those 3 to 4 years, and 83 different species at the minute. What type of species are being monitored, you might be wondering? Well, we've deliberately discussed this scheme with the National Parks and Wildlife Service, and we deliberately frame it around the vascular plant red list, and we focus mainly on species that are vulnerable, near threatened, or the rare least concerns. And also, while it's an expert citizen science scheme, it is still a citizen science scheme, so we do tend to focus on the more easily recognizable species. Just a couple of graphs to show you. I think it gives a good indication of the type of species that are being monitored at the minute. This one shows you that most species, there's 83 species that have been monitored so far, different species. You can see that most of them are near threatened. So it really is the vulnerable, near threatened, and rare least concern that the scheme is focusing on. You can also see here that for most species at the minute, there's only one single population being monitored somewhere across the country. So you see 48 species there in the bottom of the chart. There's only one population that's being monitored. We do have one species where there's 8 different populations being monitored. That is the fly orchid, and there's another one where there's 7, which is autumn lilies tressus. Just to say a tiny wee bit about the data and what happens to it. It's all held within a dedicated rare plant monitoring database within the National Biodiversity Data Centre. That's not made publicly available, so we hold it separately. It's not made publicly available, and it's not given out to third parties or anything like that. So it is a dedicated rare plant monitoring database, and an updated copy then it is provided each year to the National Parks and Wildlife Service. I'll say a wee bit about Rare Plant Monitoring Scheme workshops. So the scheme has been going great. There's huge interest in it, and I suppose we want to try and grow it a bit more. So thankfully, again, the National Parks and Wildlife Service provided a small bit of funding in 2019 and again this year in 2020 to run 6 rare plant workshops. So we're delighted that we've been working with Paul Green on these. And the way that we've organised these workshops is that they're organised in a particular area where you can go and then monitor a series of rare populations within that area. What I then do is open up the workshop. Whatever area it's in, I pull out all the casual recorders who've submitted data from the area over the last 18 months, and it's only those recorders then that are sent an invite to the workshop to see if they want to come along. They're small, so a small number of participants. Actually, in this year, we've reduced that again down to 6 in light of the COVID-19 restrictions, so each workshop is small. And then during the workshop, Paul shows how to recognise the plants, and all the people on the workshop watch him doing the count for that year. Afterwards, what we do then is fill in the forms. So the form is filled in, the photos are attached and all sorts like that. The forms are then emailed out to all the participants, and the populations are sort of put up for adoption. So we put up each workshop we might visit, 5 or 6 different rare plant populations, send back the 5 or 6 forms by email, and then they're all put up for adoption. And the hope that one of the participants then will agree to annually monitor themselves into the future. So the workshops have been great. Paul's super at this, so that's a big part of it. But they've worked really well. So a total of 11. So we ran 6 workshops last year, 6 this year. So we have 11 have been run so far. There's 1 more to go, which is happening next Saturday. So far we visited 52 new rare plant populations. 51 of them have been adopted. And actually, I suppose when we started these, I was a bit worried, that the people wouldn't come along, but then they might not adopt. And it's been the opposite of that, to be honest. The quickest adoption took place in 12 minutes. And actually, it's more of a problem that everyone wants to adopt everything. So, which is fantastic to see, but it really just, it shows you the interest, and to see them with the workshops. And there's only 6 places on each, and they're only advertised to people in the local area, but they book up literally within about an hour of the email going out, so it just shows this huge interest out there within, plant recording communities of things like this, and of tasks, I think, like this. I suppose just to say, talk a bit about the advantages of this type scheme. The first one, I hope, is that it can grow into a long-term scheme that is collecting high-quality data on our rare species. The second one, and I think this is really important, it taps into a big network of people out there who want to collect plant data, but they want a relatively small and discrete task. So not everyone, I suppose, has the time or the skill or the inclination, maybe, to do square bashing and things like that. But there's an awful lot of people we find that would love to do something small and discreet. And I think this really taps into that. Hopefully then it's an additional framework that helps support plant conservation. Hopefully it can help make the next vascular plant list as accurate as possible, and or certainly contribute, data that will feed into it. And maybe, it might allow rare plants to be better protected. I also manage the All Ireland Pollinator Plan. We've kind of used this approach a lot within that, where you try to link up local communities to something interesting that occurs where they are. And that approach has worked really well because they feel, an ownership of it and sort of a protectiveness of it. And I think, this scheme, that there's probably scope for exploring that also here, in this case. There are, of course, limitations with something like this. It's a citizen science scheme, so you're totally reliant on volunteers' generosity in taking part. And for that reason, you can't then guarantee those data streams. So this would never in a million years be the only way that you're collecting rare plant data. It's always going to be a supplemental stream that adds to those other surveys that are taking place on a more professional basis. Again, citizen science, it only works if the people enjoy doing it, and importantly, I think they feel that what they're doing is worthwhile and that you're actually using the data they're providing to do something useful with it. Again, citizen science, so you can't include very difficult to identify species. For health and safety, we don't include aquatic species. And again, obviously, validation is incredibly important that those people who are taking part actually have identified the correct thing to start with. And again, citizen science streams grow organically. So there's a lot of stuff I'd like to do with it, but the fact that citizen science, you have to be a wee bit patient, and you have to, give it time to grow and develop into where you might like it, which is not necessarily the case, if it was funded. Also, there's funny limitations with it. If you were, for example, paying someone to go out and do rare plants, or, if you were, an expert volunteer, you'd have a GPS and you'd be able to give a 10 or a 12 figure grid reference. Whereas in this scheme, they don't tend to have GPSs, so they can't. You're more reliant on them marking exactly on the map or given, written instructions as to where it occurs. So small things like that, are a limitation. And of course, things like COVID-19's had a huge impact on everything, but again, it certainly has a big impact on citizen science initiatives. And that has been the case with this. We won't know the full impact until towards the end of the year, but it looks like probably 30 to 50% of the populations couldn't be visited this year by the volunteers, due to restrictions on travel. Just, I suppose, coming towards the end, a couple of ideas for the future. First thing is that what we see is there is a huge appetite for plant monitoring, and it's good to follow on from what Abby was saying, and it's a super, the BSBI monitoring scheme is super, and you can see that with that as well. There really is just this huge appetite for that kind of schemes. So a couple of ideas. The first one is, it's actually Paul Green's idea, so I'm not going to claim credit for it. When Paul and I organise the rare plant workshops, we always have 2 points of discussion. One is where I'll say, Paul, I would love to go down the side of that cliff or into the big body of water, but I might get in trouble if we brought the group. So we might have to rethink the locations. And the other thing is, Paul will say, what about this species? And I'll say, oh, it's not really rare enough. And he'll say, but it's the only one in the county. And he's right. So I suppose there's been, what we've been discovering certainly this year, is that there are so many other things that are locally rare that would be really interesting to monitor, particularly when we can see the interest in these groups coming out to take part. So I think there is huge scope to expand the scheme, maybe not just at the minute it's focused on monitoring things that are very rare nationally or across the island, but there is huge scope, I think, to monitor things that are a bit more locally rare, maybe link into county rare plant registers. And there are definitely untapped networks of people who would love to do something like that. And the other thing, and again, following on from Abby's talk, the BSBI, have fantastic monitoring schemes, and I think it would be great, perhaps, for in Ireland, for the BSBI and the data centre maybe to come together and just to discuss whether there are initiatives that we could work on that might, systematically monitor the wider flora in various other ways. I think there's huge scope, and again, if the National Biodiversity Data Centre can offer any support whatsoever to the BSBI in Ireland, we would be delighted to do that. So again, to finish up, if you know of a rare plant population you'd like to take part in the scheme, please do get in touch. I think, yourself, when you find something really interesting, you develop sort of a protectiveness of it. I know myself, which is part of the reason why I set the scheme up, to be honest. There's some things near me here, and I always go back every year to see if they're okay anyway. So it was sort of tapping into that, and I think, lots and lots of us do that. And, just by simply collating all that data together and storing it, it brings a huge added value to it. So if you do know of some rare plant populations and you would like to get in touch, please do send me an email. We don't usually publicize this scheme, as trying to explain that it's sort of self-selecting, so it's kind of reliant on people already knowing where they are. So we don't hugely publicize it, because then what happens is we get people saying, oh, I want to take part, but where will I go and find something? And that's really just not the way that we want it to work. Just lastly to say, over the last number of years, and I do want to pay credit to Maria, who really started this whole process, and now Sarah, and it's fantastic. I think, the National Biodiversity Data Centre and the BSBI, we really have been sharing thoughts, sharing ideas, and working together, and, we're delighted to do that. As I said, we will support you in any way, shape or form that we can in the future, and I hope that, we can continue to work together, and things will go from strength to strength. So again, thank you very much for asking me to be part of today. It's really interesting to hear all the other talks, and wishing you all the best for the rest of the day. So thank you.